Welcome to FARview, the podcast series of the Foundation for Auditing Research. In this podcast, we interview academics and professionals regarding the practical relevance of academic research in the field of auditing. The Foundation for Auditing Research is an autonomous institute focused on developing and disseminating scientific knowledge concerning audit quality in the Netherlands. FAR pursues these objectives by facilitating relevant and rigorous academic research through a unique collaboration between academia and audit practice. Dear listeners, welcome to a new episode of FARview. My guest for today's episode is Dr. Justin Leiby. He's an associate professor of accountancy at the University of Illinois. Justin, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So one of the things that we do in a podcast, especially because listeners usually comprise out of an audience of academics and non-academics, is give you a chance to introduce yourself. So who are you and what do you do?
That's a nice broad question. I like the leeway I have here. I'm an associate professor of accountancy at the University of Illinois. I've previously been on the faculties at the University of Georgia and the University of Florida, so all in the United States. I got my PhD at Illinois as well. It's a little unusual to kind of find your way back home, your academic home at least, so to speak. My research interests throughout my career have been in the area of auditing primarily, focusing on really the social aspects of auditing and the weighting of social factors like social bonds, social status, empathy. And that's really been a focus of my teaching as well, which focused on auditing up until this most recent year when I created a new master's course in our data analytics track, which it has a name that's not very descriptive. It says Risk Management and Innovation. And it's a class that focuses on managing risk in an enterprise, which can auditing as a component, but really focuses on using empathic design thinking ideas to bring empathy to the data. So allowing accountants and forcing accounting students to consider stakeholders' thoughts and feelings before and how they might react to risk before starting to understand or come up with solutions about how to manage risk most appropriately in an organization.
This is the very first time that I've actually seen this type of quote. So I was doing some background research into your function as a lecturer, so the education that you do. And this is indeed one of the things that struck me, is that you said one of the goals you have is to help students bring empathy to the data, which sounds very, in a way, out of place in the world of accountancy. So could you divulge me? Could you go into this a bit more?
Right. This has been an interest of mine for quite some time. And it's no secret that in many fields, research suggests in medicine, in business, in engineering, there is an empathy deficit. And accountants, just the very personality profile of an accountant is generally not one that is the type of person who generally considers feelings of others or processes things on an emotional level. Indeed, I am not someone who does that. But over time, it struck me as how much emotions and feelings drive decision making in the real world.
Right.
And so much research has focused on how do we take this out of decision making? How do we sort of correct this problem? And rather than looking at it as a problem to correct, maybe we should view it as a reality to embrace and work with it as opposed to working against it. And it's driven some really interesting experiences. And to put a face on it, take COVID-19, for example. Every data point on which decisions are made, business decisions, medical decisions, public policy decisions, every data point is a human face, a story, a set of motivations, social relations, and we will benefit ourselves and benefit society much more effectively if we view the world at least partially through this lens. We can't lose the analysis. You can't take the analytic component out of the accountant, but you can supplement it with other things.
Well, that's a very unique way of looking at things. This is not something I've come across. a lot in the world of accountancy. Another quote by you that struck me, and I guess is representative of this approach that you try to embed in education, at least, is understanding decision makers is emotions is a crucial skill in business, especially for a subject like risk that people experience so idiosyncratically.
Yes. Oh, they absolutely do. The and to draw this into the world of empathy, there's some research that's very interesting, and it's something as simple as purchasing a bottle of wine,
Hmm.
and it can go from that context to something as serious as a physician recommending a medical treatment to a patient. We fundamentally understand risk and make decisions about risk differently for ourselves than we would if we were making it on behalf of someone else.
Yep.
And generally, we're much more interested in shielding ourselves from risk and shielding ourselves from we would call it maybe the guilt
Hmm.
or regret of making a mistake than we are with others. And that can be both a positive and a negative.
Yep. So this idea of bringing empathy to the data, how is this applied in your research?
Very slowly trying to build this in. So I've looked at it from both a negative perspective and from a positive perspective. Um, and right now, probably the most direct line of empathy in my research is a working project, sort of a developing project, where we're trying to use or examine the use of virtual reality as a supplement for remote work.
Okay.
So rather than using, say, Microsoft Teams
Mm-hmm.
or Zoom, using virtual reality settings that immerse users in the same environment, based upon research that virtual reality environments can be beneficial
Right.
in the development of empathy and other interpersonal bonds, at least beneficial relative to, say, two-dimensional like
Yeah.
teleconferencing apps.
So does this, because we had a podcast on this recently on social presence theory, and this sounds like it touches
Mm-hmm.
on social presence theory. Is that correct?
Um, there are a lot of psychology theories out there.
Hmm.
I'm not familiar with that particular one by that name, but it might be something very, very close.
Well, the basic idea boils down to social cues and the benefit of having social cues when you interact with clients, so that just doing an audit through email is a
Mm-hmm.
lot less efficient than doing it over the phone or doing it in person. So the VR could be an added layer to that, or the next level to that.
Right. Yeah. So that makes a lot of sense. This would be certainly overlapping with the idea
Hmm.
that social presence and the ability to read verbal and nonverbal cues like body language.
Yeah.
Like right now, I see you on a screen and I see you nodding your head, so that's comforting to me. It's sort of in communicating engagement,
Hmm.
and it goes beyond that in the theory that we'd be relying on. Um, there's something that they refer to really as task embodiment. So
Okay.
and it relates to what value the user places on the objects in their surroundings. So it's sort of not just like how can I see what your facial expression is, but do I feel as though I am in this place and with this other person, and I want to understand my surroundings and this other person.
Yeah.
And one great advantage over it, just as an example, over say like Zoom,
Hmm.
is that VR is free from distraction.
Hmm.
So if you're in Zoom, right now, we could be looking at anything in the room you're in the room I'm in.
Right.
You could be playing with a pencil, you could be
Right.
doing any other things, but in VR, you're in this completely immersed world.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
So that embodiment is a key component to building empathy, and then what they call task engagement. So just how much you're invested
Hmm.
in your performance of a given task.
So the goal of this research would be to find practical implementations of virtual reality for the business environment.
Yeah, that would be it.
Wow.
We're in very early stages right now, but yeah, taking it as not just a training tool, which a
Hmm.
lot of fields have used virtual reality as a training tool,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
moving it beyond that and using it as an actual mechanism
Wow.
to deliver certain audit procedures, which can have benefits for empathy building. It can
Hmm.
have benefits for trust building. And it can also, if it can replace face to face interactions, if we think about the world in which we live, where face to face interactions might be curtailed, it could have benefits in the realm of reduced travel time,
Yeah,
smaller
yeah, yeah.
carbon footprints, reduced stress due to jet lag, reduced productivity due to
Yeah.
travel. The benefits
Can be far-reaching.
are quite far-reaching. Yes.
Yeah. That's amazing. So this sounds like very timely research, but I guess that the proposal for this type of research you've drafted months and months ago. So this was before the COVID-19 crisis.
It was, but what was nice about it, at the very least, is that in trying to pitch the idea, um, you start with a write up, and you try to get the reader hooked.
Hmm.
And I think it
Yeah,
might be a little bit easier to hook the reader if you can start by saying, you know, 88% of global companies moved to required or strongly encouraged remote work. And this is
definitely.
now suddenly not just a theoretical issue, it is a reality.
Yeah, for all of the downsides of the COVID-19 crisis, there are some upsides for research and for getting research that is very timely and very to the point of this crisis funded. That's one of the major benefits, I guess.
Yes, I actually heard there was a visitor to my course, a risk executive, uh, who at a financial institution in the United States, and she made a very nice comment about a silver lining of COVID-19. If you have to find one, is that companies and the old guard at companies who have been very resistant to the idea of remote work
Hmm.
are being slowly persuaded that remote work can be effective.
Yep.
And it's something that younger generations have been insisting and demanding this flexibility for a long time. And it may finally be the case that the those in charge are seeing the value because they've been forced to see that value.
Yep. Yeah, that's very true. So this is the new research that you're kind of embarking upon, and the reason, of course, that I contacted you for this podcast is the research that you have been doing for the Foundation for
Sure.
Auditing research. At the beginning of 2018, you started your project, and it was titled "The Effects of Expert Status on the Audit of Complex Estimates." So there's a number of things that for me don't immediately ring a bell. So first of all, what's an audit of complex estimates?
Oh, sure. So financial statement items generally contain, I should say, financial statements generally contain balances or accounts
Hmm.
that depend upon the realization of future events. So
Okay.
we'll take a number, a concrete number that we'll assign today, but we don't know if that number is 100%
Right.
verifiably true, because we don't necessarily know how many of our customers may default in the next 6 months, 12 months,
Okay.
whatever it might be. We don't know necessarily if an asset will continue to be useful,
Hmm.
6 months, 12 months from now. We don't know if a company we acquired will be worth the same amount
Hmm.
6 months, 12 months from now.
So that's being put under enormous pressure, of course, because well, the current pandemic causes a lot of uncertainty in a lot of different fields.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the verification process around these estimates, which is
Hmm.
all audit is doing, is testing reasonableness. It's not testing whether they're true, just reasonable.
Right.
Is going to be put under an even greater microscope, because when there's a downturn, that's generally when auditing becomes, or I shouldn't say becomes. A downturn is generally when the public will focus its attention far more on the auditing process,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
they'll be asking questions about, well, where were the auditors in verifying these numbers and making sure these numbers were reasonable. Um, it, when we see crashing stock prices,
Hmm.
and businesses going bankrupt, and all these other negative signals.
Yeah, of course. So the project that you embarked on for FAR, could you give a summary for the listeners? What it entailed, what the research questions were, what the proposed methodology was?
Sure. So it really starts from a very broad premise, which is that the way in which we assess expertise as people is fundamentally incorrect. You cannot necessarily know what an expert knows or how good they are at what they do
Hmm.
because they're an expert. Their knowledge is unobservable to you. Taking recent events as an example, COVID-19, there are lots of talking heads on TV, toxicologists, epidemiologists, doctors. We don't know how smart they are, but we tend to use uh, I'll call heuristics, rules of thumb,
Hmm.
and those rules of thumb are often wrong. We tend to base our views of how smart someone is on, are they on TV? Well, if they're on TV, they must be smart. Are they confident? Well, if they're confident, they must be smart. And those things are often true, but they're often untrue. And this connects back to auditing because an important part of the audit of a complex estimate is the use of an expert,
Right.
because the auditor may not know necessarily what the value of a petroleum reserve is. They're an accountant, not an engineer.
Yep.
So they have to bring in an expert. And the idea here is something that regulators have actually been concerned about, not in these exact terms, not mentioning status, but they've generally been a little concerned that auditors are relying on experts too willingly. We'll just say the person is an expert. I can rely upon them. End of story.
Hmm.
Without delving deeper into what the underlying quality of the specialist work might have
Yeah, yeah,
been.
yeah.
And our idea is that the auditors might confuse these status signals,
Hmm.
so signals of someone's social standing, importance. So where did they get their degree from?
Yeah.
How confident they are? Who their social connections are with, for their substantive expertise.
Yeah. So these are used as kind of proxies to gauge how much of an expert actually is. And the reason why you couldn't know that downright is because, of course, you're not an expert in this field. So how would you be able to tell if someone actually is as good as they say they are? So you move towards these proxies of social status and their social network, but those proxies might be faulty. Is in essence what the literature says.
Correct.
Okay. Right. But that sounds like a very difficult subject to study because the indicators that are being used are often soft indicators, often have to do with your intuition and your gut feeling, and then a couple of proxies that may or may not hold true. So how do you study this effect?
Right. We had to do this in multiple stages.
Hmm.
So we started with the literature, and took a set of, oh gee, I want to say 13 to 18, the number escapes me,
Hmm.
characteristics that could be associated with high status,
Hmm.
but could also be associated with other things. So we had to start by saying, can we first separate those things that are legitimate indicators of status from legitimate indicators of knowledge? Because a lot of times they're connected. So you went to a great university, that could mean you're both high status and high knowledge.
Hmm.
And we wanted to find those that are more status and less knowledge. So we actually surveyed 53 practicing auditors and had them go through a survey and rate based upon, just knowing this characteristic. So the person, say for example, say a person plays tennis with firm leaders.
Hmm.
How does that influence your perspective of their knowledge? How does it influence your perspective of their social status? And we did this for a variety of attributes, and then we found those attributes that were rated by auditors as being relatively predictive of status, but less predictive of knowledge.
Okay.
Uh, and then after that, we could use those survey results to conduct an experiment where we actively manipulate what auditors see when they're say put in a world where they are auditing a client's complex estimate,
Mm-hmm.
and they receive an expert's report, we can tell half of the auditors, well, you're receiving an expert report from someone who has, a good amount of knowledge, experience, et cetera. And then the other half would see a report that says you're seeing a report from someone who has a good amount of knowledge, experience, et cetera. But they also, uh, are the member of social organizations
Right.
that are attended by
Mm-hmm.
prominent politicians and national leaders.
Right.
They play tennis with firm leaders, things like that. Things that
Right.
shouldn't be predictive of knowledge, but are predictive of status.
Mm-hmm.
With the idea that auditors will rely on those cues and confuse them with
Mm-hmm.
genuine expertise.
So the idea was to keep the knowledge as a constant and then make variable the status indicators.
Correct.
Okay. So how do you conduct this type of experiment? So the surveys, I understand, you go to any number of firms, you ask them about all of these different indicators that they might rank from 1 to 10, for instance. But how do you perform an experiment in this kind of setting?
Well, an experiment in this setting is really subtly different versions of the same survey, and
Okay.
it's sort of like a case study. We created a case based upon some input from practitioners, and in this experiment, it was the audit of an investment property,
Mm-hmm.
um, and really the consideration of the discount rate used to value an asset, and you give auditors subtly different versions. So I just gave an example. Half the auditors receive an expert report as
Mm-hmm.
part of the case study that includes this sort of medium status set of signals, and the other half receive a case that includes these set of high status signals.
Okay. And then the result from that you put into a regression analysis, I'm guessing, and
Yeah,
you look at what the outcome is.
right.
S-
Right, and I should add some complexity on top of this, as though
Sure.
this weren't complex enough. Um, so, in addition to each auditor receiving one of those two status conditions, we also manipulated what the specialist said to sort
Okay.
of get at the manner in which auditors would confuse status for
Mm-hmm.
legitimate substance. So we gave them one of three reports. So each auditor only saw one set of specialist status
Okay.
indicators and one memo,
Mm-hmm.
and we manipulated whether and by manipulate I just mean vary. So
Mm-hmm.
we just gave each auditor, when they saw the report, they saw one of three reports. One where the auditor agreed with the specialist
Yep.
and provided strong justification, and that was our baseline.
Yep.
Because
Yep.
in that condition, status shouldn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing should matter. If the specialist says that the client's estimate is fine, then it should be, and provides good justification, then it should be fine. But then there
Okay.
were two real conditions that we were very interested in, based upon theoretical tension, and then based on really practical tension about what regulators have expressed concerns about. The first was one where the specialist, or the expert, I should say, uh, agrees with the client but gives very poor justification. In this case, the auditor should be questioning what
Mm-hmm.
the specialist does. They shouldn't just listen to the specialist in this case.
Yep.
And then the other one is if the specialist actually disagrees with the client's estimate and says it's not reasonable.
Mm-hmm.
And what we expected going into this was that the auditors, there'd be a positive and a negative, that the auditors would be more willing to go along with the specialist,
Mm-hmm.
the high status specialist who disagrees. So it would actually sort of embolden the auditor to disagree with the client and push back, which would result in higher quality financial reporting.
Yep. Yep.
But on the other hand, if the specialist provided poor justification that agreed with the client, the auditors would also be more willing to go along with the high status specialist who disagreed but didn't really provide a good argument.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
One
and
of
then go ahead. Oh, go ahead.
Well, no, no, no. I mean, explain, please, because this is very interesting. These results are quite interesting.
Yes, and so but what we ultimately found, we only found that half of that actually comes to pass.
Hmm.
We found that the auditors actually did uh, I would say they were emboldened to disagree with the client when the high status specialist disagreed,
Hmm.
which is encouraging. And then we also found that the auditors really did not go along with the high status specialist when the high status specialist agreed with the client and didn't provide a good argument
Okay.
for their agreement.
Yeah.
So there was a nice silver lining there that auditors were using this status quo as a way to disagree with the client
Hmm.
and not really as a way to go to agree with the client more than maybe they otherwise should.
That's quite
Um,
encouraging.
it's encouraging. Yeah, there are some other discouraging results, but that's the way research usually works. There's usually a good side and a bad side.
So one of the things that struck me reading the working paper, because of course the research that you've done, the surveys and the experiments have resulted in a research paper that has now been published at the SSRN website. I guess at this point it's pending at a journal. I don't want to push you too much on this if you don't want to share this. But one of the things that struck me is that one of the conclusions you have is auditors know that high social status is not a valid signal of competence, but they still use this signal in their judgment anyway. What? Why? What causes this? If they know, then why do they still use it?
This is I find this to be a fascinating finding too, and
Mm,
only and it's to state it really getting at their the result
mm,
is that auditors, we ask them to evaluate the client's estimate, but we also ask them to just evaluate the specialist, the expert, because that's what they do in practice. They have to establish that the expert actually is competent in their field and capable.
yeah,
So we have them assess competence and we have them evaluate the estimate. So when they're assessing competence, they are unintentionally confusing status with competence. That's what we found in the experiment, and I don't want to get into too many complexities for the procedures we used, but we can
mhm,
say with confidence they don't really know what they're doing, um, and but in relying on the specialist to evaluate the estimate, they do know that that status that they're relying on status. So it's a very interesting, as you said, a very interesting friction there
mhm,
because they know status doesn't equal competence, but they use it anyway. And the reason why, in our view, is that the the social dynamics. Getting back to social issues,
yeah,
the
yeah,
social dynamics of the auditing process,
mm,
the negotiations, the power
yeah,
imbalances that result from the audit of a complex estimate are such that if you are going to walk into a room and tell an audit client that they need to adjust an estimate that has a material effect on their financial statements, you need to have clout. It's not enough to have
yeah,
expertise
yeah.
and have a good answer. You need to have clout in order to be able to persuade them to change.
Very true.
And so auditors know that competence and status are not necessarily the same thing, but they also seem to know that competence isn't enough
Hmm.
when it comes to auditing these estimates. You need to have more.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
what we say in this study is that if you're going to be writing policies as a firm,
Mm.
or if you're going to be making standards around this, it might actually, as regulators, it might actually be helpful to consider attributes of this process that go beyond just competence.
Hmm.
Because clearly, auditors do not believe competence is the only thing that's important
Hmm.
in this process.
So what additional attributes would you suggest?
The one that we suggest in the paper
Mm.
is influence within the firm. That
Okay.
generally, if a person has a more powerful social network,
Hmm.
and say a specialist or an expert has a more powerful social network, or if anybody does for that matter, generally speaking, they'll be more emboldened to tell the audit team to have a backbone and stand up to their clients, because there are a lot of potential consequences of standing up to clients. You, at the extreme, potentially irritate them and they want to seek out another audit firm.
Yeah.
Or it just creates a lot of tension and discomfort in the audit engagement.
Yeah.
And what cloud allows to do, what that influence allows you to do, is smooth the waters. And social status allows someone to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. So is this what you think would be the main takeaway for practitioners if they read this paper when it's finally published? Is this one of the main things they should take away from it?
I would say so.
Hmm.
Yes. That really, and it's probably something that practitioners may already know,
Mm-hmm.
or if they, and when I talk to them, it may not be something that they know, but something that if you tell them about it, they'll kind of nod their heads and say, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That considering stuff beyond just the competence of an expert
Yeah.
is crucial.
It can be
And
something they
there's,
know,
oh,
but not necessarily something that's been quantified before.
right, exactly. It's sort of like the what we were just talking about, the intentional versus unintentional usage of status as a cue to
Yeah.
assess competence. Sort of
Yeah.
like, well, I unintentionally do that, but if you tell me that I'm doing it, I'll probably recognize it and I'll stop.
Yeah. 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 Is this the final product of your research project at FAR, or are you planning to do more working papers on the same subject or related subject?
Yeah, this has been the continuation of a stream of research that I've done on social connections, social bonds, of which status is a type,
Hmm.
uh, and how this influences how auditors use the opinions of others.
Yeah.
And I've done this in their peers, from experts, and then how they provide advice to others. So I imagine I'll do additional research in this area.
Hmm.
But certainly, this is the final product of the FAR project,
Yeah.
which has
Yeah. Yeah.
been
Yeah.
remarkably fun, and we've learned a lot.
Well, I can imagine. Do you know how many respondents you had on the surveys that you ran?
So we had 53 responses on the initial survey, which we used to really try to separate knowledge from status.
Hmm.
And then in the final experiment, we had about 200 people in total,
Well, it's a good sample.
which was made possible by the FAR and its generous support. It's not something that's very easy to do, and it's a very cumbersome process usually, but it was far less cumbersome thanks to the FAR's help.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I guess we'll end it there.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for contributing to this podcast. It's very interesting research, and I think the firms will be quite happy to see it finally published. Hopefully, it finds a good journal very soon.
I hope so as well.
Thank you very much, Justin.